we don't have to let go of our belief that God is coming soon to still do things in a way that is responsible and is thinking about being here in the long run.
Yeah.
It shouldn't be blasphemy to talk about 50, 100, 200 years from now. And for some people, they get real nervous when you start talking that way because they feel like, well, you just have a lack of faith. Well, I would challenge that. From every generation since the beginning of time has thought that they were the last generation. I'm pretty sure Adam and Eve thought that when God explained to them the plan of salvation, that they would live to see that. My parents were told when they converted in the early 60s that they were the last generation. Well, we're here still, and it's not taking away from the fact that they could have been the last generation, but they weren't. And so the decisions that were made then are affecting us now and affecting the rest of the planet.
Well, welcome back to Advent Next, a theological podcast curated for curious faith discussions. This week, we are continuing our talk with Dr. Daniel Gonzalez-Socoloske, professor of ecology at Andrews University. Last week, we discussed the importance of developing something called a land ethic, where we begin to develop a moral sense for how to interact with natural resources and other creatures that inhabit this planet. This week, we are discussing what we as individuals, as a collective, and the church can do about being more mindful regarding our impact upon the planet. Before we get started, we want to thank the Adventist Learning Community for making this program possible. If you're not already following us on Facebook, Instagram, or YouTube, be sure to find us at the handle @AdventNext. I'm your host, Kendra Arsenal, and this is Advent Next.
What are the implications of that? Like this butterfly I was telling you about that I was studying in the 5th grade, or that I did a report on in the 5th grade. Mitchell Sater, it's called. It's a tiny, tiny butterfly. The adult will only flutter around for like a week. That's its entire life. It pupates. It finds a mate. The female lays eggs, and then she dies. The male dies.
That's a lot of pressure for 5 days.
Yeah, well, they live in small habitats, so they have a way of finding each other, use pheromones and whatnot. Then the eggs will stay dormant over the winter, and then they'll begin the cycle again the next spring. It's an amazing structure. So if this species disappears, it's only found in like a handful of locations in Southwest Michigan and northern Indiana. That's it, globally. It's an endemic. Endemic means it's found nowhere else. We lose this butterfly, so what? Well, we've certainly lost many species, and we're continuing to lose species, right? Where we lose all members of that species, and that's tragic because you can't get them back. But what does that really mean ecologically? It means that now, whatever that service, if you will, or whatever role that species played in the ecosystem is no longer available. So there's a cascade that occurs. There might have been organisms that depended on that butterfly for pollination, or maybe organisms that depended on that butterfly as a food source. Well, now they're going to be affected, and they're going to have to either switch over to something else or meet the same fate. And so as you start plucking pieces of the web away, it begins to crumble. It's like a house of cards, right? Wow. And that's the real fear, right? When ecologists talk about the tipping point, what will that tipping point be before you get to sort of the ecological cascade where the ecosystem collapses?
Wow. I mean, that's pretty harrowing. And I mean, we see this everywhere when it comes to whether it's the coral bleaching that's happening and how that's affecting, I mean, just even the sea alone is such a crazy ecosystem, and it's a very delicate ecosystem. But, you know, the overfishing of the seas, or things that we're doing, the global warming, how that's affecting things, it's going to have a more global effect.
Yeah. And this is where global treaties are very important, right?
Okay.
Because there's only one ocean. The names we give it, Arctic, Pacific, Atlantic, these are just geographical inventions. But there's one ocean. There's no separation of those water bodies. They're all connected. And so what happens in one eventually gets to the other. Plastic is a real issue. Like, we only started making plastics in, the 1940s? So we're 80, 60 years into making plastic. And we're producing plastic at tremendous rates.
Yeah.
Where does all that plastic go, right? Plastic is made from petroleum-based products, and it doesn't disintegrate. there's no natural breakdown of that plastic. There is no natural existing mechanism for it to be broken down to be recycled back to the nutrients that biological life uses.
Right.
So everything else on the planet is built on this system of perpetual recycling. Energy flows through the system. The sun's energy fuels life by harnessing or allowing plants or anything that photosynthesizes, so algae and protists and whatnot, some bacteria. They're able to use the sun's energy to take CO2, carbon dioxide, and make it into sugars, right, into glucose. And then everything else feeds off of that. You and I feed off of that.
Right.
All the nutrients involved cycle. So everything else is cycling. Nitrogen is cycling in its system. And so what's fundamental for everything to work is that when things die, there needs to be organisms that break everything down. And there's a whole suite of organisms that are devoted to that. Fungi, the whole kingdom of fungi, that's what they do. They deal with dead organic matter, breaking it down so it could be reused again. Plastic violates that system.
Interesting.
There's nothing that plastic breaks down to that can be then used again. And so it doesn't go back to being that fossil fuel that it originally was because we made it synthetically. And we didn't do it with ill intention.
Yeah.
But now, many, many decades later, we're finding plastic everywhere in places that humans are not around. So the deepest parts of the ocean, plastic. Desolate areas, wherever in the planet,
right.
Plastic, in the forms of microplastics, right? Wind-blown microplastics. The sun will break down the plastics into small beads, but it's still there. And then we ingest that. So fish have plastic. Bottled water has plastic. We are full of plastic if we examine. And we don't know the full effect of that. It has not been looked at because we're sort of the plastic generation, you and I.
Wow. That is so interesting. Somebody who's listening and is like, what can I do? Or is there something, stories of hope? I remember maybe 10 years ago, and I don't know whatever happened to this initiative, but they were looking at using algae farms to create biodiesel to be able to run cars off of, but I don't know where that has gone since then. Like, are there interesting inventions that are taking place? Is there a way that we can innovate ourselves out of this problem?
Well, yes and no.
Okay.
Technology is not going to solve our problems because part of the problem is a moral problem, right? And this is where we get to the question of what kind of planet do we want to live in? Technology is amazing, and there will be revolutionary things that are invented in the future that will certainly buy us more time. No one is denying that. That's just human ingenuity, especially when we're pressed against the wall and we have to come up with something. But this problem is bigger than what technology can solve, in that the root of the problem is our own behavior. And so here we are, 2020, following that growth curve that has been well articulated. And the question is, where will we top off? At what point is too many humans on the planet too many?
Yeah.
Some would argue we're already at that point, because it depends on how those humans are going to live. If everyone were to live the way that first world nations live, particularly Americans, then there's too many already, right? We would need several planets to accommodate the resources necessary.
Wow. So
it's either we continue this disparity of some have a lot and some and a lot of people have very little and keep growing, or we try to remain at the population level that we are and then try to balance out a little bit the allocation of resources. These are difficult things. Wow. We're talking about very, very controversial and difficult adjustments, if you will.
Wow.
Yeah.
I think that's interesting. So, like you said, we might be able to buy more time with technology, but there's a moral issue and it has to do with how we live.
Yeah, because it ultimately comes down to the respect that we have for the rest of nature, the value that we put in it. This is where that land ethic comes in. If we just look at the rest of the planet as resources that we should use or should have access to, then we're going to be in trouble one way or the other, no matter how much technology we have.
Yeah.
Right? This is where I make that argument that depending on how you look at creation. If you look at creation as a holistic thing where we are a component of God's creation, then you're less likely to indiscriminately utilize the resources just for human purposes or for greed, if you will. If you look at the creation as two isolated events, God creates man, and then he creates a garden, or maybe he created a garden first, if you take Genesis 2, and then he creates man and he places man in the garden. Then there's this like us and them, right? This clear distinction between humans and the rest of creation. And then we're sort of exempt from the responsibility of anything that happens to the planet, especially if you tie that to the end is near, we're getting a new planet.
Yeah.
So that's a dangerous formula. I challenge my students. What does it even mean to be human? Because in biology, everything depends on everything else. It's very difficult for me to go in and pluck out an organism and sustain that organism in sort of a laboratory scenario. It's very artificial. That's not the way that nature works.
Yeah.
Even you and I, now we're in this microbiome revolution, right? Where we're tying human health and psychology and all these things to our microbiome. What is our microbiome? You and I are an ecosystem. I mean, we're a multicellular eukaryotic organism, which has consciousness. That's you and me. But this body also shares a ton of cells that aren't mine, that are prokaryotes, that are bacteria. For every one cell that's in your body that belongs to you, that has your genetic makeup, you have another cell that is a bacteria. It's a one-to-one relationship.
Interesting.
I cannot remove those from you. They do very, very important things. They make up the flora in your stomach that help you digest things. They make up the flora in your mouth that helps do things there. And so the more we realize that there's this intimate relationship between the metabolism of those of that microbiome and things like cystic fibrosis, things like we're finding all these links where diseases are tied to imbalances, not in your cells, in the cells that are living with you, your sort of symbiotic cells. So what does it mean to be human?
Wow.
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that.
I think that's so fascinating to look at the body as its own ecosystem, because one thing I took away from your talk was that we don't tend to look at ourselves as cohabitors of the planet. We, like you said, we look at ourselves as we're the ones here and we're going to utilize these resources. Thank you very much.
Right.
But the fact that your own body is its own ecosystem, there are things that are living there. And to be a good steward of your health means to be a good steward of the ecosystem.
Right. And they're not squatting. They are a part of you as much as you are you. I mean, this is where I have no idea how to reimagine the human without that. That is a part of being human.
Wow. So how did you get into, kind of with everything that's happening and the world's going upside down, you are working with manatees.
Yes. So I kind of fell into the manatee field. In my undergrad, I worked with mammals.
Okay.
I've always been interested in mammals. And there was a paleontologist that worked with squirrels, and that was the closest thing that I could, that was a mammal. It was that or birds, or I forget what else was available at that time. And so that was the interest that I went in. And then for my master's, I fell into a Manatee Project. And then once you specialize in something and you get to know the literature and you get to know the professionals, you sort of become an expert in that. And so it becomes second nature. Although I tried, there was an effort to switch over to primates for my PhD. I worked under a primatologist, as I mentioned before. It's just that a Manatee Project popped up during my PhD. It was just too tempting to say no to, and I went right back into it.
So what was this Manatee Project? And something like a manatee, who just kind of floats around, is very harmless. Some people might say, what's the importance of this animal remaining in our oceans?
Yeah, lots of people actually say that. Florida's really interesting because nobody's on the fence, right? People either hate the manatee or they love the manatee passionately. And it's really interesting to walk into that. People are like, why do you love manatees so much? I don't signal manatees out. That happens to be what I know the most of because that's the lion's share of my research. But I don't have any greater love for manatees than I do for, I'm like a little kid when I go into a forest. I want to touch and experience everything. And I if it's a boa constrictor, a manatee, an otter, they're all amazing and cool to me. It's just, that's what I happen to specialize in. But I've dabbled. I mean, I've worked with the eastern Massasauga, our only venomous snake here in Michigan. We have a little rattlesnake that lives in very specific habitats. Had a master's student that worked on a project with them, and right now I'm working with a collection of mammals from Peru. So my interest is broader than manatees. That just happens to be what I would be known for.
So in your specialty, how are manatees important to the ecosystem and the planet?
Yeah, so I guess, in many senses, I feel bad that we even have to justify the existence of another organism, because I feel like intrinsically they all have their own value.
Right.
You don't see manatees getting together and saying, well, what is the value of humans if humans weren't around? The truth is, if humans weren't around, a lot of other things would be better off. That's a harsh thing to say, but we don't really play a vital role for anything other than maybe our domestic animals that have greatly benefited from us. But manatees, they have ecological roles that they fulfill. They certainly recycle nutrients. They consume a lot of algae and seagrasses and vascular freshwater vegetation. And then as that goes through their system, they are going to release nutrients. So there's a fertilizing event that occurs there. So they play a role similar to what a terrestrial herbivore would play. Yeah,
that's interesting. And I love that what you said, we shouldn't have to justify the existence of living organisms. And I love the way that God, in a lot of ways, is an artist and how he creates, and the fact that not everything in our ecology is it has utility to it, but it's not purely utilitarian. That there's a sense of beauty and art and creation, and like, wow, look at this magnificent creature who has a purpose, but may not be so obvious.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to philosophical views, right? If you view the world as essentially a backstage, a prop, creation as a prop to humans. So everything was sort of built for our pleasure and for our amusement and to give us a better quality of life. Then what do? Well, when you see a tree, you say, well, what value does that tree have to me? What product can I get out of that tree? And if I can't come up with something, then I am justified for not taking care of it.
Yeah.
Part of the problem with that is that you disregard, some of the problem is that we have no clue all the things that nature provides for us. Just because we don't have something that we can extract from it now doesn't mean in the future we won't be able to, through new technology or new knowledge, find that maybe that's got the cure to cancer for all we know. That's one. But two, we also are disregarding all of the relationships that exist in nature. So maybe there is something that we are very, very fond of, let's say our crops or whatever, and we don't realize that by disregarding bees, we are essentially killing our own crops. And so it's understanding how the system all comes together.
Yeah.
And I think, arguably, you should be able to defend most any organism that exists that is not an invasive organism, that is an organism that we accidentally introduced into a place that's kind of wreaking havoc. So things even like mosquitoes, oftentimes students will say, well, what on earth would I want mosquitoes around for? Why would I want mosquitoes? And I say, well, mosquitoes provide food for a ton of stuff. In fact, every bat species we have here in Michigan, all 9, are insectivores, right? They all eat mosquitoes. So if I were to wipe out all the mosquitoes, that's food for all those bats. All those bats are gone. Well, what are those bats good for? You start getting through this never-ending question of, what is it good for? But what you're really saying is, what can I get out of it? And I don't think that that's how God views nature.
Yeah, no, that's so true. In fact, I watched a documentary recently called The Biggest Little Farm. I don't know. Have you seen that one?
Mm-mm.
It's so good because they try to have this principle of building everything together where all of the animals, even the coyotes that they thought were the enemies and they were coming and killing their chickens, they found a way to navigate that so that actually the coyotes started eating the gophers who were pulling up some of their crops. And so they found a way to navigate, like, how do we work with the perfect ecosystem? And so
previously you asked me, are there like success stories? And I kind of dodged the question. And the truth is there are many, right? We enacted rules, laws. The Environmental Protection Agency was put together. We enacted the Endangered Species Act, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the Marine Mammal Protection Act. These were all enacted ironically, during the Nixon administration in the 70s. And they have teeth. These aren't just foofy rules that or acts that slap you on the wrist if you don't do it. They have legitimate fines, and there you can be legislated, and there can be incarcerations for violating these acts.
Wow.
And the effect has been huge. And we have seen species that were on the brink of extinction, some that we brought down to like double digits, the condors, California condors, the bald eagle, the emblem of our nation.
Yeah.
We through pollution, the use of certain toxins, brought it down to we drastically reduced the range of the bald eagle, and their numbers were suffering greatly. That species has now rebounded. The bald eagle is back to its former range. We see bald eagles here in Berrien Springs now.
Wow.
So it's a tremendous success story of enacting a rule that at the time maybe seems unnecessary or harsh and has real-world implications and results. Look how we have cleaned up our air. Talk to the old-timers about the air quality in Southern California. Before the, in the 50s and 60s, before the enactment of this. Talk to them about water quality in streams and water bodies. Lake Michigan was heavily polluted. You wouldn't want to swim in Lake Michigan. And now we don't think twice. We go back and there's no problem. The issue, though, is that we get complacent. We take the state that things are in for granted, and we forget that there was effort to get it to that point. And so we fall through this, this vicious cycle of things are bad, we enact protection, we recover, and then that generation forgets what it was like, and now everything is fine. So it's like, these rules are too harsh, it's holding me down, And so we fall asleep at the wheel, and corporate interests break those down. We're seeing that right now.
Wow.
This current administration has severely pushed back environmental regulations across the board. And we will see the effect of that in the next 10, 15 years or sooner. And so we take for granted what we have and what the hard work that it's taken to get to that. But I think the lesson there is that protection works, enforcement works, rules work. And so I would encourage people to not throw their hands up in the air and say, there's nothing I can do, and realize that, no, there's a lot you can do, and your vote is very powerful, and your voice is powerful. There's so many ways that you can get the word out now with social media, and it's a double-edged sword, I agree, but we live in a time where it's much easier to get the message out and to organize. We talked earlier about our collective bargaining power that we have in civil society. But I think as a church, and part of why I wrote this article is that I'm a believing Adventist, and I love my church, but I also see the focus of my church neglecting this topic. And again, I don't think it's for malicious reasons, but nonetheless, the effect is the same. So the end result is that we take very little, if any at all, consideration for our impact on the planet in the decisions that we make. If you think about the infrastructure that we build, what hospital or what school or what church uses an environmental ethic as part of their decision-making for when they're building a church.
Yeah.
We don't think about the resources that we use. We don't think about how it's going to be sustainable or the energy type that we're going to use. And we should.
Yeah.
We really should. We don't have to let go of our belief that God is coming soon to still do things in a way that is responsible and is thinking about being here in the long run.
Yeah.
It shouldn't be blasphemy to talk about 50, 100, 200 years from now. And for some people, they get real nervous when you start talking that way because they feel like, well, you just have a lack of faith. Well, I would challenge that. From every generation since the beginning of time has thought that they were the last generation. I'm pretty sure Adam and Eve thought that when God explained to them the plan of salvation, that the serpent's head would be crushed by the heel of the woman, that they would live to see that. Well, here we are, thousands of years later, and certainly even with the model of our own church, the early Adventists thought that they were the last generation. My parents were told when they converted in the early 60s that they were the last generation. Well, we're here still, and it's not taking away from the fact that they could have been the last generation, but they weren't. And so the decisions that were made then are affecting us now and affecting the rest of the planet.
Well, that's a really great point. And what's interesting is that, we have an opportunity as a church to really be a light. And we see a lot of, the secular community coming up to par with where the Adventists were about the health message.
Yes.
And you see a lot of that happening now. And we have that same opportunity to be the head rather than the tail when it comes to even environmental or ecological issues.
Yes. And some people I've heard are hesitant to jump on the environmental train, if you will, because, the Pope has said some things about climate change, and we don't want to do what the Pope has said, or that, there are secular groups that push this, particularly scientists, et cetera, and there's some hesitancy there. And I just don't understand that at all, because I think that we should evaluate movements based on how they coincide with our faith and our beliefs. And if they coincide with our beliefs, then we should be supporting those, right? There's no question that the biblical argument for environmental stewardship is strong, very, very strong. In fact, there's language in the Bible, I'm sure when you spoke with Dr. Wells, that gives warning to those who destroy the planet, and it's not a nice result, right? So, I don't want to preach fire and brimstone, but certainly there's some strong biblical language about our responsibility towards the planet. And I think that we should, like you said, be on the forefront. And there's so much that ties in with our philosophical views, right? This notion of living simplistic lives, non-materialistic, sharing things. I know it goes against the American sort of independent culture of everybody having their own stuff and keeping up with fashion and following this treadmill of consumption that is very difficult to break away from. But that's not the Adventist, at least in theory, that's not the Adventist philosophy.
And it seems to me, and when I see all these successful movements that are happening, and it was like, well, God gave this message to this church 200 years ago, it kind of seems like, well, God is going to have to work around the ways that we've been stubborn and just get things done. And I think that sometimes that can be a rebuke to say, step it up in some ways.
Yeah, and do we have examples in the Bible of God commanding something or ordaining something that was time sensitive, that made sense then but doesn't make sense now? Absolutely, right? So people will point towards, God said at the end of creation, be fruitful and multiply. That's great when the planet was empty, right? But be fruitful and multiply today in 2020 means something different, right? What does it mean now to have a large family, for instance, versus 50, 100 years ago? When you look at what human population, the journey of human population and the growth, I think the responsible thing now is to include a land ethic when we're planning our families. These are difficult things. Nobody likes to be told what to do, what to buy, how many kids to have. But we either make these decisions or they're going to be made for us the hard way, right? And like I said, we may not face those consequences immediately. Some of us will. We're a global church. We have Adventists everywhere. But not only our Adventist brothers and sisters, but our fellow humans will feel our decisions directly. So there should be some pull in our conscience when we make our decisions.
Wow. So you mentioned the power that we have as a collective, as a community, the ways that we can use our vote to kind of enact positive changes.
Yes.
So how can the church work together as a collective community to be able to enact positive change?
So if we use the same analogy, we as the church body, the members, we can make positive changes in our local churches, in the way that we do things and how we make decisions. The student body can make positive changes we forget sometimes that students are the paying customers, and they have tremendous collective bargaining power. They just don't know it. But if they organize and they demand A, B, or C, it'll happen, because at the end of the day, they have a choice and they can go elsewhere and they can seek places that follow what they believe in philosophically. So if this was something that is something that they value and they organize, then I'm pretty sure that all of our universities would begin following suit. So if they say, we would like there to be active recycling on campus, it would happen. If they say, we would like there to be some kind of committee where anytime a new building is being proposed, that it follows some recommended, certification, external certification for following, a green perspective, right? A certain percentage of the energy has to come from renewable energies. The materials have to be sourced from renewable sources. Will we be able to build as much as we would have built if we did it the other way? Probably not. But we did the right thing, right? And that's what it comes down to. It's thinking long term. It's not thinking short term. And then as a church, as a global church, the GC, we could put tremendous pressure on the GC to also think not just as an ethic towards God and an ethic towards fellow man, but also encompass the land ethic, right? There's an enormous amount of power that we have as a global church in the influence that we have. And so I think that, there are many things that come to mind that if we incorporated a land ethic as a church, that we could sponsor and we could do, and we could be sort of on the forefront of that, without compromising our belief in a creator, without compromising these things that we hold dear. It's not one or the other.
We're so glad you tuned in to this final episode on environmentalism and the church. We hope you were inspired to think more consciously and creatively about how to make changes beneficial to the planet, both personally and collectively. We want to thank the Adventist Learning Community for making this program possible, as well as our guest, Dr. Daniel Gonzalez-Socoloske. If you're not already following us on Facebook, Instagram, or YouTube, be sure to do so at the handle @AdventNext. Thanks so much for tuning in, and see you next week.